Hi, ninth and 10th. We are continuing with our lectures on fairy tales. It takes a while to get through them all, but it's no different than all the short stories we've read in the different categories that we've gone through in the textbook. These are actually a little bit shorter. We're getting through about one story per day or per lecture. And the next one is going to be one of my all-time favorites, probably because when I was a child and reading this, it scared me. And I think everybody likes a little bit of fear mixed in with their, everyday life. I won't say that for everybody, but for this one, it was a little on the scary side. And you're probably going to, when I tell you the name, you're going to say, how in the world is that scary? Trust me, for me, it was a little on the scary side. We are going to be starting out with, you ready? Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. I know, you're all thinking, no, it's not scary. Okay, let's go through it, shall we? This is by Charles Perrault, who is my favorite fairy tale author, which is why he's in my textbook, because if I'm writing the textbook, I can put whoever I want in there. So, Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. Once upon a time, there lived a king and queen who were grieved, more grieved than words can tell, because they had no children. So we have a crisis, or what we call conflict, right at the very beginning. They tried the waters of every country, made vows and pilgrimages, and did everything that could be done, but without result. At last, however, the queen found that her wishes were fulfilled, and in due course gave birth to a daughter. A grand christening was held. Okay, so we know a little bit about the king and queen. We know that they're very religious. They've traveled to try the waters of every land. That's mineral waters from natural springs. And that has a little bit, it's mostly just vacationing kind of thing, but there is a little bit of a background there with both Christianity and paganism, looking at that water coming from the earth as being more holy and pure and able to cure disease. And when we talk about making vows and pilgrimages, that's directly related to the Catholic Church. Vows would be made. Those are promises you make to serve God a specific way. Pilgrimages, those were all over medieval Europe. I was going to say medieval Europe during the medieval times. That would be brilliant. During medieval Europe, people would go to shrines of saints and pray and ask the saints to please pray on their behalf to God, so that they could have their wish or their prayer fulfilled. So the queen ends up getting pregnant, very excited about it. They're going to have a grand christening. A christening is a very special moment, especially in a Catholic child's life. There are other religions that do christen. It's a type of baptism. It's not a baptism to say, I've made a conscious decision to follow Christ, and therefore I am showing the world that I am a follower. Instead, christening is really about preserving that child in the eyes of God until they can grow up and confirm that they are a follower of God. Okay. It also is really a lot of dedication toward the parents. And of course, there's also going to be godmothers and godfathers involved. Okay. So a grand christening was held, and all the fairies that could be found in the realm, they numbered 7 in all, a lucky number. It's found in the Bible as the number of God. It's long been a lucky number because it is an odd number, so it has 1 number in the center and then 3 on each side. Sorry. And then we see here that we're bringing in the fairies. Okay, so even though this family is very religious, they've got a foot in each camp. They're religious and Catholic, and they're also religious and a little bit of pagan. And the fairies were invited to be godmothers. Hey, remember we talked about that this idea of godmothers goes right back to paganism. It's a combination of paganism and Catholicism. So we see them invited to be godmothers to the little princess, which means they're going to raise her also in 2 camps. She's going to be on both sides of that world. This was done so that by means of the gifts which each in turn would bestow upon her in accordance with the very custom of those days, the princess might be endowed with every imaginable perfection. So mom and dad are saying, we want all the fairies in the land to be her godmothers because they will bestow upon her special gifts. These are more than spiritual gifts. These are going to be mystical gifts. Okay. When the christening ceremony was over, all of the company returned to the king's palace, where a great banquet was held in honor of the fairies. Places were laid for them in magnificent style, and before each was placed a solid gold casket containing a spoon, fork, and knife of fine gold, set with diamonds and rubies. Okay, so when you think about how this table is set up, each place setting for the fairies, they had a casket, a box, that when they opened the lid, all of their place setting was in there. It was all of pure gold and encased in jewels, or jewels were encased in it. And so when they were done with the dishes, they could close the box and take it home. That was also their party favor. It was quite extravagant. And each one had to be specially made for each fairy. But just as all were sitting down to a table, an aged fairy was seen to enter, whom no one had thought to invite. The reason being that for more than 50 years, she had never quitted the tower in which she lived, and people had supposed her to be dead or bewitched. We have an unintendedly uninvited fairy who shows up at the last minute. There is no special gold casket for her. Nobody's recognized that she was even in existence. They thought she had died or had bewitched herself. For a fairy to bewitch herself, it means she cast a spell that rebounded on her and basically blew her to smithereens. Seriously. Okay. By the king's orders, a place was laid for her. It's not going to be the fancy one, but it was impossible to give her a golden casket like the others, for only 7 had been made for 7 fairies. The old creature believed that she was intentionally slighted and muttered threats between her teeth. Okay, this is one of the motifs we find also in mythology. Whenever there's a sacrifice and one of the gods or goddesses is not recognized, it's usually Hera that gets left out, and then she loses her ever-loving mind and starts torching the place and starts punishing the people who did the sacrifices, because how dare they forget I existed. Okay, so this is something carried on in motif. She was overheard by one of the young fairies who was seated nearby. The latter, guessing that some mischievous gift might be bestowed upon the little princess, hid behind the tapestry as soon as the company left the table. Her intention was to be the last to speak, and so to have the power of counteracting as far as possible any evil which the old fairy might do. So the youngest fairy is listening to this woman muttering, and she's like, oh, she's not going to do anything good, so she's going to hide so that she can be the last one to speak. Presently, the fairies began to bestow their gifts upon the princess. The youngest ordained that she should be the most beautiful person in the world. The next, that she should have the temper of an angel. The third, that she should do everything with wonderful grace. The fourth, that she should dance to perfection. The fifth, that she should sing like a nightingale. And the sixth, that she should play every kind of music with the utmost skill. It was now the turn of the aged fairy. Shaking her head in token of spite rather than infirmity, in other words, she's so mad she's shaking, she declared that the princess should prick her hand with a spindle and die of it. A shudder ran through the company at this terrible gift. All eyes were filled with tears. Okay, we can learn a couple of things from these 2 paragraphs. For instance, we know something about the culture in which, during the time that this was written, we know what they found to be the most important gifts for a person. And we're talking here not about presents, but a person's personal gifts. You know, I have a sense of humor. I'm also very sarcastic. It's a gift, trust me. I like to read. I mean, those are parts that make up my personality and my character. Now, some people don't appreciate that part of me. Who would have thought? But that's okay, because they have their own parts of their personality that are found to be lovely. For the princess, when we talk about the gifts that she was given by the fairies, these are the things that were the most important to their culture at the time. So things like being beautiful, having a good temper, doing everything with grace, being able to dance, to sing, and to play music, that was incredibly important to their culture. But with the fairy, she's going to come up with a curse that is going to make everybody gasp. There's not going to be any oxygen left in that room. The idea that she should prick her hand on a spindle. Now, the spindle, it's kind of hard for us to really comprehend that today, because most of us don't do a lot of weaving or spinning. Basically, what it is you take fiber like linen, or, linen is not the fiber that makes linen, okay? The flax. So you take flax or cotton, or probably in this case wool, and it is stretched out and combed through, and then the fibers are then woven together. They're wrapped together through a spinning wheel process, and then there's also a spindle there. It's either the beginning of the process or the end of the process. I'm sorry, this is not my gig, but it's really not supposed to be sharp in the first place. And there's no reason why a princess in a castle would actually be doing any of this unless it was something she was doing for her own edification. A lot of women, even of high rank, would do sewing and embroidery. So it's not beyond the thought process, not beyond the pale, that she would be able to spin in the palace or to weave in the palace. But this is kind of it's an everyday kind of activity. It's done just kind of for fun for the princess. She doesn't actually have to make her own clothes. Okay, but this is how the fairy is going to punish her. At this moment, the young fairy stepped forth from behind the tapestry. "Take comfort, your majesties," she cried in a loud voice. "Your daughter shall not die. My power, it is true, is not enough to undo all that my aged kinswoman has decreed. The princess will indeed prick her hand with a spindle, but instead of dying, she shall merely fall into a profound slumber that will last 100 years. At the end of that time, a king's son shall come to awaken her." Okay, so the young fairy doesn't have as much power because she's not as old, so she doesn't have the life experience. So we see a little motif there. But she's saying, okay, I can't undo it, but I can change it just enough. Okay. The king, in an attempt to avert the unhappy doom pronounced by the old fairy, at once published an edict forbidding all persons, under pain of death, to use a spinning wheel or keep a spindle in the house. So no one in the palace is allowed to have one. At the end of 15 or 16 years, the king and queen happened to one day to be away on pleasure bent. They're on vacation. The princess was running about the castle and going upstairs from room to room. She came at length to a garret at the top of a tower, where an old serving woman sat alone with her distaff spinning. The good woman had never heard speak of the king's proclamation forbidding the use of spinning wheels. "What are you doing, my good woman?" asked the princess. You have to remember, she has been protected all these years. She's behind walls, so she doesn't recognize this contraption that this old lady is using. "I am spinning, my pretty child," replied the dame, not knowing who she was. "Oh, what fun!" rejoined the princess. "How do you do it? Let me try and see if I can do equally well." Partly because she was too hasty, partly because she was a little heedless, but also because the fairy decree had ordained it. No sooner had she seized the spindle than she pricked her hand and fell down in a swoon. Okay, there's a couple of things here. It's like, she's just hasty? Yeah, that's part of it. Was she careless? Yes, that's part of it. But the big part is she could not change her fate. This, again, is one of the big themes, not necessarily a motif, but definitely a theme from Greek mythology. The idea that mankind cannot control his own fate. They can't change anything. They can try, but it's not going to happen. Everything is preordained. In great alarm, the good dame cried out for help. People came running from every quarter to the princess. They threw water on her face, chafed her with their hands. They would chafe the wrist and the neck, looking to get blood flow going. They rubbed her temples with royal essence of Hungary. It's probably a vinaigrette that smells, so it would wake you up if you were fainted. But nothing would restore her. Then the king, who had been brought upstairs by the commotion, remembered the fairy prophecy. Feeling certain that what had happened was inevitable, since the fairies had decreed it, he gave orders that the princess should be placed in the finest apartment in the palace, upon a bed embroidered in gold and silver. So the king had tried to stop the prophecy, had forbid the use of spindles and spinning wheels, and then when his daughter ends up being put to sleep by one, he's like, okay, well, obviously I couldn't stop the prophecy, so we're not going to wake her. There's no way. It's not going to happen. Let's just make her as comfortable as possible. Okay, you would have thought her an angel. So fair was she to behold. She's pretty. The trance had not taken away the lovely color of her complexion. Her cheeks were delicately flushed, her lips like coral, her eyes indeed were closed, but her gentle breathing could be heard, and it was therefore plain that she was not dead. The king commanded that she should be left to sleep in peace until the hour of her awakening should come. When the accident happened to the princess, the good fairy who had saved her life by condemning her to sleep 100 years was in the kingdom of Mataquin, 12,000 leagues away. She was instantly warned of it, however, by a little dwarf who had a pair of 7-league boots, which are boots that enable one to cover 7 leagues at a single step. The fairy set off at once, and within an hour, her chariot of fire, drawn by dragons, was seen approaching. Wow, there's a lot of stuff going on in here. Okay, let's talk about the good fairy is far away, but a little dwarf who had a pair of 7-league boots. I love these boots. This comes up in a couple of fairy tales. A 7-league boot means that you can walk with 7 steps. You can go 7, or with a step, you can go 7 leagues. A league is 3 miles. So that's 21 miles a step. That means you could take a step from our church and end up in downtown Yucaipa. Okay. So from school to Yucaipa, 1 step. That'd be pretty amazing. You could get to Disneyland in like 4 steps. Or no, it'd be more than that. You could get there in like 15 minutes. So it's pretty awesome. Okay. I'm fantasizing again. Ooh, I could travel all of Europe. Okay. So she sets off at once. She's got a chariot of fire, like Phaeton, but hers is drawn by dragons, not horses. And so she's seen approaching. The king handed her down from the chariot, means he helps her down, and she approved of all that he had done, but being gifted with great powers of foresight, she bethought herself that when the princess came to be awakened, she would be much distressed to find herself all alone in the old castle. And this is what she did. She touched with her wand everybody except the king and queen who was in the castle. Governesses, those are teachers, they're live-in teachers. Maids of honor, ladies in waiting, gentlemen, officers, stewards, cooks, scullions, errand boys, guards, porters, pages, footmen. She touched likewise all the horses in the stables with their grooms, the big mastiffs in the courtyard. A mastiff is a dog, very large dog. And little Puff, the pet dog of the princess, who was lying on the bed beside his mistress. The moment she had touched them, they all fell asleep, to awaken only at the same moment as their mistress. Thus they would always be ready with their service whenever she should require it. The very spits before the fire, loaded with partridges and pheasants, subsided into slumber, and the fire as well. All was done in a moment, for fairies do not take long over their work. So the idea is that when this princess wakes up, everything will be just as it was when she went to sleep. Then the king and queen kissed their dear child without waking her and left the castle. Proclamations were issued forbidding any approach to it, but these warnings were not needed, for within a quarter of an hour there grew up all around the park so vast a quantity of trees, big and small, with interlacing brambles and thorns that neither man nor beast could penetrate them. The tops alone of the castle towers could be seen, and these only from a distance. Thus did the fairy's magic contrive that the princess, during all the time of her slumber, should have naught whatever to fear from prying eyes. At the end of 100 years, the throne had passed to another family from that of the sleeping princess. One day the king's son chanced to go a-hunting that way, and seeing in the distance some towers in the midst of a large and dense forest, he asked what they were. His attendants told him in reply the various stories which they had heard. Some said there was an old castle haunted by ghosts, others that the witches of the neighborhood held their revels there. The favorite tale was that in the castle lived an ogre, who carried thither all the children whom he could catch. There he devoured them at his leisure, and since he was the only person who could force a passage through the wood, nobody had been able to pursue him. While the prince was wondering what to believe, an old peasant took up the tale. "Your Highness," he said, "more than 50 years ago I heard my father say that in this castle lies a princess, the most beautiful that has ever been seen. It is her doom to sleep there for 100 years, and then to be awakened by a king's son for whose coming she waits." The story fired the young prince. He's like, "Oh yeah, let's go." He jumped immediately to the conclusion that it was for him to see so gay an adventure through, and impelled alike by the wish for love and glory, he resolved to set about it on the spot. Hardly had he taken a step toward the wood when the tall trees, the brambles, and the thorns separated of themselves and made a path for him. Again, this is fate stepping in. You can't change it. You can only kind of go along with it. So as soon as he steps up to the brambles, they part, showing that, yes, the time has come. He turned in the direction of the castle and espied it at the end of a long avenue. This avenue he entered and was surprised to notice that the trees closed up again as soon as he had passed, so that none of his retinue were able to follow him. A young and gallant prince is always brave, however, so he continued on his way and presently reached a large forecourt. The sight that now met his gaze was enough to fill him with an icy fear. You'd be scared too if you went through this. The silence of the place was dreadful, and death seemed all about him. The recumbent figures of men and animals all had the appearance of being lifeless, until he perceived by the pimply noses and ruddy faces of the porters that they merely slept. It was plain, too, from their glasses, in which were still some dregs of wine, that they had fallen asleep while drinking. The prince made his way into a great courtyard, paved with marble, and mounting the staircase, entered the guard-room. Here the guards were lined up on either side in two ranks, their muskets on their shoulders, snoring their hardest. Through several apartments crowded with ladies and gentlemen in waiting, some seated, some standing, but all asleep, he pushed on, and so came at last to a chamber which was decked all over with gold. There he encountered the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. Reclining upon a bed, the curtains of which on every side were drawn back, was a princess of seemingly some 15 or 16 summers, whose radiant beauty had an almost unearthly luster. Trembling in his admiration, he drew near and went on his knees beside her. At the same moment, the hour of disenchantment having come, the princess awoke, and bestowed upon him a look more tender than a first glance might seem to warrant. "Is it you, dear prince?" she said. "You have been long in coming." That's right. In this version of the fairy tale, there's no kissing, because that would have been a little weird. Okay? Charmed by these words, and especially by the manner in which they were said, the prince scarcely knew how to express his delight and gratification. He declared that he loved her better than he loved himself. Slow down there, Bucky. You just met the girl. She, on the other hand, has been dreaming about him this whole time. His words were faltering, but they pleased her the more for that. The less there is of eloquence, the more there is of love. The idea of being tongue-tied because you're so in love with a person. It's cute. Her embarrassment was less than his, and that is not to be wondered at, since she had had time to think of what she would say to him. It seems, although the story says nothing about it, that the good fairy had beguiled her long slumber with pleasant dreams, and that to be brief, after 4 hours of talking, they had not succeeded in uttering one half of the things they had to say to each other. I like this part of the fairy tale, the fact that they don't just, he comes upon this sleeping girl, kisses her, and then she wakes up and says, "Oh, I love you. Oh, I love you too." No, instead, they spend some time talking. I like that. Now, the whole palace had been awakened with the princess. Everyone went about his business, since they were not all in love. They presently began to feel mortally hungry. It's been 100 years since lunch. The lady-in-waiting, who was suffering like the rest, at length lost patience, and in a loud voice called out to the princess that supper was served. Okay, the princess isn't noticing her hunger because she's getting to know this guy. I'm not even worried about her appetite. Everybody else is starving, though. The princess was already fully dressed and in a most magnificent style. As he helped her to rise, the prince refrained from telling her that her clothes, with the straight collar that she wore, were like to those his grandmother had been accustomed. "You're just like my granny." And in truth, they in no way detracted from her beauty. They passed into an apartment hung with mirrors, and were there served with supper by the stewards of the household, while the fiddles and oboes played some old music, and played it remarkably well, considering they had not played at all for just upon 100 years. A little later, when supper was over, the chaplain married them in the castle chapel, and in due course, attended by the courtiers in waiting, they retired to rest. Yes, they got married the same day, but again, not an unusual thing during medieval times for nobility. It wasn't an unusual thing for nobility to meet, marry, because all of that was arranged ahead of time for them. They slept but little, however. The princess indeed had not much of sleep, and as soon as morning came, the prince took his leave of her. He returned to the city and told his father, who was awaiting him with some anxiety, that he had lost himself while hunting in the forest, but had obtained some black bread and cheese from a charcoal burner, in whose hovel he had passed the night. Why lie? Why lie, O prince? The royal father, being of an easygoing nature, believed the tale, but his mother was not so easily hoodwinked. She noticed that he now went hunting every day, and that he always had an excuse handy when he slept 2 or 3 nights from home. She felt certain, therefore, that he had some love affair. 2 whole years passed since the marriage of the prince and the princess, and during that time they had 2 children. The first, a daughter, was called Dawn, while the second, a boy, was named Day. Get it? Because she was asleep for 100 years, and so she relished the day and the dawn. Yay! Because he seemed even more beautiful than his sister. Obviously, that wasn't taken into account for this illustration. Many a time the queen told her son he ought to settle down in life. She tried in this way to make him confide in her, but he did not dare trust her with his secret. Despite the affection which he bore her, he was afraid of his mother. Uh-oh, it's getting juicy. For she came of a race of ogres. That's right. His mummy was part ogre, and the king had only married her for her wealth. Ooh, daddy. It was whispered at the court that she had ogreish instincts and that when little children were near her, she had the greatest difficulty in the world to keep herself from pouncing on them. No wonder the prince was reluctant to say a word. But at the end of 2 years, the king died, and the prince found himself on the throne. He then made public announcement of his marriage, and he went in state to fetch his royal consort from her castle. With her 2 children beside her, she made a triumphal entry into the capital of her husband's realm. Some time afterward, the king declared war on his neighbor, the Emperor Cantalabute. He appointed the queen mother as his regent in his absence and entrusted his wife and children to her care. Obviously, mom had more experience running the kingdom than the wife did. Of course, the wife had been asleep for 16 years. He expected to be away at the war for the whole of the summer, and as soon as he was gone, the queen mother sent her daughter-in-law and the 2 children to a country mansion in the forest. This she did that she might be able the more easily to gratify her horrible longings. A few days later, she went there, and in the evening summoned the chief steward. For my dinner tomorrow, she told him, I will eat little Dawn. Oh, madame, exclaimed the steward. This is my will, said the queen, and she spoke in the tones of an ogre who longs for raw meat. You will serve her with a piquant sauce, she added, piquant meaning spicy. The poor man, seeing plainly that it was useless to trifle with an ogress, took his big knife and went up to little Dawn's chamber. She was at that time 4 years old, and when she came running with a smile to greet him, flinging her arms around his neck and coaxing him to give her some sweets, he burst into tears and let the knife fall from his hand. Presently he went down to the yard behind the house and slaughtered a young lamb. For this he made so delicious a sauce that his mistress declared she never eaten anything so good. At the same time, the steward carried little Dawn to his wife and bade the latter hide her in the quarters which they had below the yard. 8 days later, the wicked queen summoned her steward again. For my supper, she announced, I will eat little Day. The steward made no answer, being determined to trick her as he'd done previously. He went in search of little Day, whom he found with a tiny foil in his hand, that's a sword, making brave passes, though he was but 3 years old, at a big monkey. So little kids playing with a monkey, and somebody armed the monkey, so he's sword fighting with it. He carried him off to his wife, who stowed him away in hiding with little Dawn. To the ogress, the steward served up, in place of Day, a young kid so tender she found it surpassingly delicious. So far, so good. But there came an evening when this evil queen again addressed the steward. I have a mind, she said, to eat the queen with the same sauce as you served with her children. This time the poor steward despaired of being able to practice another deception. The young queen was 20 years old, without counting the 100 years she'd been asleep. Her skin, though white and beautiful, had become a little tough. He's actually worried about the quality of her meat. Okay, and what animal could he possibly find that would correspond to her? He made up his mind that he would save his own life. He must kill the queen, and went upstairs to her apartment, determined to do the deed once and for all. Goading himself into a rage, he drew his knife and entered the young queen's chamber, but a reluctance to give her no moment of grace made him repeat respectfully the command which he had received from the queen mother. This moment of grace that he's giving her, he doesn't want to kill her while she's still what would be considered in her sin. He wants to give her a moment to do her final confession and to get herself right with God before he murders her. So while he's offering this, he tells her why he's going to kill her, and it's because of the queen mother. Do it, she cried, baring her neck to him. Carry out the order you have been given. Then once more I shall see my children, my poor children that I love so much. This mom is heartbroken. She's lost both of her children. They just disappeared, and she has absolutely no idea where they are. She assumes they're dead, and she's ready to die too because she is just so heartbroken. Nothing had been said to her when the children were stolen away. She believed them to be dead. The poor steward was overcome by compassion. No, madam, he declared, you shall not die, but you shall certainly see your children again. They will be in my quarters, where I have hidden them. I shall make the queen eat a young hind in place of you, and thus trick her once more. A hind is a deer. Without more ado, he led her to his quarters, and leaving her there to embrace and weep over her children, proceeded to cook a hind with such art that the queen mother ate it for her supper with as much appetite as if it had indeed been the young queen. The young queen mother was well satisfied with her cruel deeds, and planned to tell the king on his return that savage wolves had devoured his consort and his children. It was her habit, however, to prowl often about the courts and the alleys of the mansion in the hope of scenting raw meat. And one evening she heard the little boy Day crying in a basement cellar. The child was weeping because his mother had threatened to whip him for some naughtiness, and she heard at the same time the voice of Dawn begging forgiveness for her brother. The ogress recognized the voices of the queen and her children and was enraged to find she had been tricked. The next morning, in tones so frightening that all trembled, she ordered a huge vat to be brought into the middle of the courtyard. This she filled with vipers and toads, with snakes and serpents of every kind, intending to cast into it the queen and her children, and the steward with his wife and serving girl. By her command, these were brought forward with their hands tied behind their backs. Yeah, this is the part that scared me when I was growing up. I don't like snakes. There they were, her and her minions were making ready to cast them into the vat, when into the courtyard rode the king. Nobody had expected him so soon, but he had traveled post-haste. Filled with amazement, he demanded to know what this horrible spectacle meant. Heard there's his wife and kids all tied up. There's a vat of snakes. Ugh. Okay. None dared tell him, and at that moment the ogress, enraged at what confronted her, threw herself head foremost into the vat and was devoured on the instant by the hideous creature she had placed in it. Ugh. The king could not but be sorry, for after all she was his mother, but it was not long before he found ample consolation in his beautiful wife and children. It's a good story. Okay. All right, that's our first one for today. I'm going to take a quick break, record another lecture for another class, and then I'll do your second one. I'm sorry it takes so long to do these. When we were in class, all I had to do was open the books and we could read together in the books, and I'd let you read some and I'd read some. But now that we're doing everything online, it takes me time to actually transfer these stories from the book to the slides, and then I'm illustrating so that they're not just plain black text on plain white background. So it does take me a little bit of time, and I'm sorry about that. It's just life. Okay. But go ahead, take a little break and get your homework done for this story, and I'll see you very soon. Bye.